The Italian Fascist Party understood that fashion is a powerful tool. Throughout its reign of terror, the regime used theatrical parades, mass media, and fashion to erase individuality and promote Mussolini's violent vision for the future of Italy. At least, that was their plan. In this video, we'll explore the history of the Italian fascist regime's projects for fashion, as a platform for propaganda, and as a vehicle for economic independence. In doing so, we'll uncover 7 key lessons on fascism to better understand the world's most destructive political ideology. I'm Taipei, and this is the history of how fascists have no drip. Before we get started, I want to make it clear that this video is intended to provide historical education on Italian fascism. The point of this video is to show why fascism is terrible, and I've done my best to make that argument abundantly clear. Fashion was always essential to the fascists, even before they came to power. With the end of World War I in 1918, Italy was left in a state of political chaos. The collective trauma of trench warfare combined with mass unemployment to create a fertile breeding ground for populist movements, and in the violent scramble for power that ensued, the fascist party became synonymous with their uniforms, the black shirts. The black shirts were first adopted by the fascist paramilitary gang known as the Squadristi. This uniform had multifaceted symbolism, a connection to Mussolini's home region of Emilia-Romagna, the violence of World War I military costume, and the glorification of death and mourning through the color black. From 1922 to 1928, Benito Mussolini systematically dismantled Italian democracy, creating the world's first fascist dictatorship. As the fascists consolidated power during this period, the black shirts they wore became a central part of their iconography and a key propaganda strategy. This brings us to our first lesson. Fascism is the enemy of individuality. Throughout their 20-year rule, the Italian fascists attempted to use uniforms to replace individuality with their own civic religion. The black shirts worn by adult male party members were elevated to an almost sacred status. Uniforms infiltrated even the most sacred moments in life. For some forms of government assistance, being married in a party uniform was a requirement for eligibility. Uniforms were also an essential propaganda tool aimed at indoctrinating children. From 1934 onwards, teachers were required to wear fascist uniforms at school. Various party uniforms were created for fascist youth groups, even extending to infants and toddlers. Uniforms were mostly not worn as part of daily life, rather being reserved for special occasions. A large percentage of the Italian population never even had a fascist uniform, either due to personal political opposition or poverty. But despite this, uniforms were an essential part of the constant marches and rallies that constituted the fascist party's public theatrics. The message of these uniformed events was made clear by Mussolini himself in 1932. Anti-individualistic. The fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. As an individual yourself, you may be asking, why on earth would anyone support a state that has no regard for their individual liberty? Well, since fascism has nothing to offer you in the present or future, it instead promises a return to an idealized past. Number 2. Fascism is obsessed with a revised past. Despite being nominally revolutionary, the Italian fascists used historical iconography in their uniforms to harken back to a heavily revised past. For example, the she-wolf who cared for Remus and Romulus in Rome's origin myth was a recurring motif on fascist children's uniforms. Another recurring motif in party badges was the fascio littorio, the ancient Roman symbol that inspired the name of the fascist party. These connections to the Roman Empire were not innocuous. They were part of a broader agenda of weaponized archaeology, where the Italian Fascist Party would use the historical geographical reach of the Roman Empire to justify their violent expansionism. This included the so-called pacification of Libya, a military campaign where the Italian fascists used concentration camps, mass displacement, and chemical weapons against the Libyan civilian population. By incorporating symbols of ancient Rome into party uniforms, the Italian fascists gave a hollow promise of a return to greatness that would thankfully never precipitate. We've discussed the quasi-religious significance placed upon the black shirts and other fascist party uniforms, but given how important these uniforms were, you may be surprised to learn that over half of the population wasn't allowed to wear them. If you'd like to see more of this content, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. It's completely free and it really helps me out. And if you'd prefer to support me directly and gain access to exclusive content, you can check out my Patreon. Now, let's get back to the video. Italian women made enormous economic and cultural strides during World War I. Just like in other countries, women entered en masse into the previously male-dominated workforce, and the Italian feminist movement was gaining steam. The fashion world took note. The 1920s saw the rise of a new, liberated silhouette for women, with a drop waist and a slender, more masculine profile. This tomboyish look took on different names in different countries. The flapper in the US and UK, la garçonne in France, and la maschietta in Italy. But as is always the case after times of progress, these wartime advancements for women would meet a severe backlash. Number 3. Fascism exploits existing societal misogyny. The Italian Fascist Party didn't have to invent misogyny. The anti-feminist backlash in Italy was well underway before the fascists came to power. After the war ended, there was a major push to replace women in the workplace with male veterans, and a bill to ensure legal suffrage for women failed in the Italian Senate in 1919 and again in 1920. After they came to power, the fascists exploited the existing misogyny in Italian society for their propaganda, and one of the most visible ways that the regime would subjugate women was through fashion. Women and girls were banned from wearing the black shirts, despite them being the most iconic uniform of the fascist movement. In 1926, a party official declared, "Personally, I am totally opposed to women and girls wearing black shirts. The black shirt is the virile symbol of the combatant spirit of our revolution, and it has nothing to do with the welfare and good works that fascism has entrusted to women." Italian women weren't even given any standardized fascist uniform until the 1930s, 10 years into the fascist period. This might seem like a puzzling choice given that uniforms were so central to the fascist propaganda campaign. What's even more ironic is that the vast majority of these uniforms were made by underpaid local seamstresses or family members who were almost always women. But as the previous quote suggests, Italian fascism was a cult of male sexuality, one that wanted to ignore women as much as it wanted to subjugate them. When the Fascist Party did give attention to women, it was often to parade them as objects of propaganda. The Great Parade of Female Forces is a 1939 documentary showcasing a women's rally in Rome that was organized by Mussolini. The footage heavily features young, slender women wearing sports uniforms who are participating in various physical activities. We can see the fascist obsessions with virility, athleticism, and conformity on full display. In addition to young women wearing either athletic or militaristic uniforms, the rally also included masai rurali, or rural housewives, wearing various local traditional costumes. While these contrasting fashions may seem like a paradox, Eugenia Policelli explains this in her book, Fashion Under Fascism. What we find illustrated in the documentary footage is a visual confirmation of the two-sided, indeed ambivalent, nature of the fascist attempt to include every single woman of the Italian peninsula in its purview. In this way, the regime could show off its good face in tolerating and appearing to exalt at one and the same time the modern woman wearing the military uniform and local time-honored traditions. Fashion was also used to silence women's freedom of speech. Any women's publications that were at all critical of the fascist regime or that promoted women's rights were forced to turn into fashion magazines. This fate befell the publications La Donna in 1925 and La Chiosa in 1927. From multiple angles, the Italian Fascist Party weaponized fashion against women. Women were simultaneously excluded from the most significant party uniforms, while also being dressed like mannequins for propaganda displays. But the fascist intentions for fashion were not only cultural. As the regime began to feel the consequences of its own violent expansionism, it looked towards the fashion industry as its economic savior. In 1935, Fascist Italy would continue its bloody campaign of Spazio Vitale, or Vital Space, with its invasion of Ethiopia. The Italian colonial military would commit multiple atrocities, including the use of illegal chemical weapons and extrajudicial executions to repress resistance. This brutal invasion was condemned by the League of Nations, leading to economic sanctions placed upon Italy by other European countries. These sanctions were limited in scope, but nonetheless, they accelerated Fascist Italy's programs for autarchy, or total economic self-reliance. The fashion industry was a key target for these autarchic programs. In 1932, the Ente Nazionale della Moda, or National Fashion Body, was founded to oversee and promote the Italian fashion industry. The agency's marching orders were first and foremost to free Italy from her perceived fashion oppressor, France. Number 4. Fascism relies on a myth of national victimhood. The ultranationalism that defines fascism is always motivated by a victim complex. For Fascist Italy, England and France were positioned as the primary national oppressors, due to their global dominance both before and after World War I. Fashion contained a microcosm of this victimization myth. France had been the fashion capital of the Western world for centuries, and Italian women mostly wore designs that were dictated by Parisian trends. Even before the fascists took power, pioneers like Rosa Giannoni argued that Italy should have its own independent fashion industry and signature style, independent of French influence. The fascists would co-opt this narrative and twist it to serve their aims of economic autarchy. Most of the fascist attempts to remove French influence from Italian fashion were hollow and purely symbolic. In 1936, the ENM published Commentario Dizionario Italiano della Moda, or the Commentary and Italian Dictionary of Fashion. The publication included an extensive glossary with French loanwords that are used to describe various fashion terms, along with proposed Italianized versions. Berrette became borretta, cloche became campana, lame became laminato, etc., etc. Some of these French terms were translated, others were adapted, and others were just pronounced differently to sound more Italian. Throughout the rest of the fascist era, fashion magazines were required to use these Italianized terms to give the impression of an independently Italian fashion industry. The Franco-Italian victim complex also played out in cinema. The fascist regime heavily invested in the Italian film industry as a means of propaganda. In the 1937 film Contessa di Parma, the main antagonist is the effeminate department store manager who worships French fashions. He's opposed by the virtuous entrepreneur who uplifts and values Italian fashion. Interestingly, the Italian fashion industry did experience impressive growth and innovation during this period, but how much of this was actually due to the fascist party's theatrics? Number 5. Innovation happens in spite of fascism, not because of it. Before fascism, Italy was already a major textile exporter, in particular known for its mastery of silk production. But during the 1920s and 30s, the nation would experience a textile renaissance due to innovations in synthetic and semi-synthetic fabrics. Italian companies became major producers of viscose fabrics derived from wood pulp, and the fabric Sniaffioccio was named the textile of independence. Novel production techniques were also innovated. Lanital, nicknamed mozzarella fabric, was derived from milk proteins. Together, these innovations made Italy the second largest producer of synthetic textiles in the world after the United States. But here's the thing. This industrial expansion happened in spite of fascist government programs, not because of them. Towards the end of the fascist period, Italian designers and industrialists lamented the ineffectiveness of the national fashion fashion body, or E&M, the agency lacked much needed industry knowledge, and it moved way too slowly in an industry that was defined by constant change. Policelli summarizes this phenomenon. The project of nationalizing fashion failed for two reasons. Neither workers in the industry nor consumers responded to the regime's diktats, and instead continued to organize themselves independently. Second, the stasis resulting from the rigid model that the regime sought to impose in dress was at loggerheads with the notion of change that is the basic condition in which fashion exists. Given their ineptitude in nationalizing the fashion industry, it should come as no surprise that the fascists also lacked any sense in the realm of design. Number 6. Fascists have no drip. Despite the enormous hullabaloo about Italianizing fashion, Italians continued to follow trends set by France and the United States throughout the fascist period. Let's do a bit of fashion investigation. In February of 1925, the year that Mussolini officially became dictator, the Italian magazine Lidl published a spread on sportswear. The spread features a long-sleeve, drop-waist dress with an accordion pleated skirt that hits right below the knee. But across the Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar from February 1925 features a dress with all those same details in its sportswear section. 10 years later, we can see that fascist efforts to Italianize fashion haven't gone very far. Comparing their February 1935 issues, both Lidl and French Vogue feature tailored skirt suits with tilt hats and gauntlet gloves, as well as T-length dresses with asymmetrical paneling and button accents. These similarities make sense given that Italian dressmakers continued to covertly use Parisian sewing patterns. It checks out that the violent chauvinists making up the fascist party had no skill in the realms of beauty and design, which are the essence of fashion. Despite the party's lamentations, Italians continued to be influenced by American movie stars and French designers. What's especially ironic is that one of the most influential designers in Paris at the time was the Italian-born Elsa Schiaparelli. Despite numerous invitations, she detested Mussolini and declined to collaborate with him. Throughout the rise and fall of Italian fascism, some people fanatically supported the movement, while many others were apathetic. But what about the people who risked their lives to defy it? Number 7. People will always resist fascism. The boot of Italian fascism was met with fierce resistance throughout the empire. Both Libya and Ethiopia had resistance movements against Italian colonial invasions, which were met with disproportionate retaliation. Within Italy, anti-fascist partisan groups, or partigiani, were forced to organize in secret after the fascists banned opposing political parties. These groups would play a major role in defeating German and Italian fascism in the northern puppet state called the Italian Social Republic at the end of World War II. Many of these groups were either communists or socialist, and they operated very differently from their fascist counterparts. While fascists systematically excluded women from their ranks, almost half of all Italian partisan volunteers were women. Some of these women took on roles as active combatants, performing sabotage and using decreased suspicion of women to perform targeted strikes. In contrast to the plethora of fascist uniforms, partisans lacked the resources to manufacture standardized clothing. To identify themselves and display their political allegiance, they often opted for the most accessible option, scarves. Different colors corresponded to different political groups, with red being the most common to identify leftists. The diversity in clothing for Italian partisans was mostly the product of economic and logistical limitations, but it still shows a stark contrast to the obsessive appearance control, blatant misogyny, and scientific racism that was so evident in fascist dress codes. Fashion is a lens through which we can gain a deeper understanding of oppression and resistance. A change of dress can transform a look from nationalist propaganda to anti-fascist resistance. And as the specter of modern-day fascism approaches, how will we use fashion to resist? My content wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. Thank you to each and every one of you. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, please consider taking a look. I'm Taipei, and remember, fascists always lose. Until next time, bye.